Welcome to the Energy Transition Panel. For those that don't know me, I'm Rebecca Sherlock. I'm a portfolio manager at First Sentier Investors in our listed infrastructure team. So today I'm joined by Malcolm Johns, Chief Executive of Genesis Energy, Pedro Vasconcelos,
Perfect.
The CEO of EDPR Renewables in Asia Pac, and Tim Nelson, Executive General Manager for Iberdrola in Australia. So given we've only got like a short period of time together and obviously quite a lot of global expertise on the panel, I thought we'd kick this off with a discussion more broadly around the overall environment for renewables today, especially in the context of both corporate and government demand. And I might start with you, Tim, since we're here in Sydney. Maybe you could give us some insights in Australia.
Well, in Australia, really the size of the opportunity is huge. I mean, you've got the Commonwealth Government driving 20-odd gigawatts of investment over the next few years. The New South Wales Government driving 12 gigawatts. The Victorian Government driving 9 gigawatts of offshore. So really there's enormous opportunity. Corporate demand is also really significant. So we're seeing a lot of businesses with even reasonably moderate Scope 2 emissions now, really moving towards wanting that 100% green. And that's reflected in the value of LGCs at the moment, that there is a scarcity compared to that corporate demand, which is driving that value. So it's really a very kind of bullish type time to be in the renewables industry. There's a whole bunch of things which the renewables industry does need to work through in Australia. Transmission probably being one of the key ones, but the level of demand is extraordinary.
And Malcolm, what are you seeing in New Zealand?
The next 25 years is going to be about $40 billion worth of investment across transmission, distribution and renewables generation. In New Zealand, we've ruled out any further hydro, we've ruled out nuclear, and we've almost tapped out geothermal, so solar and wind are going to have to do the heavy lifting. So the really big challenge in New Zealand, the two scarcities in New Zealand, is actually demand. We're not seeing demand grow anywhere near fast enough to justify that level of capital deployment. And the second scarcity is in firming. The ESG discounts that have been applied to companies means nobody is investing in firming in New Zealand. And for Genesis, we're 80% of the firming market in New Zealand at the moment. And as you add more wind and solar into that mix, firming is going to become incredibly more difficult to achieve, and without that, the corporate market becomes inaccessible because you can't firm your PPAs.
And Pedro, maybe you could touch on Asia Pac more broadly, and probably slightly unfair, but maybe you could touch a little bit on the US as well.
Sure. Today, in 2023 was a good year for global renewable deployment. I think as a whole, we delivered 500 gigawatts, but we need 1 terawatt of new power renewables to actually deliver the 1.5 degrees. It's much more actually than 2022, but behind these numbers, what they tell us is that it's China doing the heavy lifting. So this year alone, 2023, China installed more solar panels than all the solar panels in existence in the US. And underneath those numbers, actually, you see a European landscape, a US landscape, which are somehow stagnant in terms of new growth. And even considering that they have Inflation Reduction Act really making a push, we have Repower Europe making a push, and it's not a question of the commitment from the federal level, but it's then the trickling down. I think we then can touch a bit upon it. It's the trickling down of those directives to the day-to-day approval of projects and the multitude of problems and barriers that renewables development have. Then on Asia, excluding China, which is doing a massive over-delivery, we have Southeast Asia, which is still very protective today, with few exceptions. So protective of its own industries, protective of its foreign direct investment, protective of coal in the process. And so still very, very far from its potential. And then, of course, we have a few highlights: Australia, even Japan, Korea, trying to make a difference in the region. So multitude of different colors throughout the globe, but China actually really delivering for everyone. Of course, they are building on the side coal plants as well. But there's this mismatch between the willingness to deliver more and the ability to deliver more I think that's a chronicle issue that this sector needs to overcome at this stage.
I mean, 2024, obviously a really big election year globally. Do you think the sector as a whole has momentum to withstand this political cycle and also to become more immune to political cycles going forward? Might start with you, Malcolm, please.
We had our election last year, so we know the outcome. And we happen to get a government that's incredibly friendly towards business and the economy. And so we're seeing a dismantling of very problematic consenting regimes in New Zealand and an accelerated pathway for consenting that will move us from years to get a consent for new renewables to months, guaranteed. And that's going to be exceptionally helpful. And in New Zealand, we have a framework that both major parties have signed up to for the next 25 years. And at its core is an emissions trading scheme, which is the market mechanism, and an emission reductions plan, which is the policy mechanism. And what we're seeing is broad bipartisan agreement across those two structures, which should give enhanced confidence to invest.
And Pedro, maybe you could follow on with that.
So, not discussing Australia in particular, but we have today, of course, or this year, at the end of the year, U.S. election. We have UK elections as well. So, stealing a quote from the Foreign Minister of Singapore, it looks like the weather is nice, but the climate is not good. And so it's extremely uncertain. It's extremely uncertain what is going to pan out, all of this. The only thing that we can do as a global investor is to be heavily diversified. We invest through foreign platforms, South America, North America, Europe, and APAC. But we cannot spread ourselves too thinly. So that's the best we can do at this stage. But the weather is nice in the sense that we see these frameworks, we see the objectives of the different governments trying to push for more renewables. I think we see then on the ground also different legislators trying to stitch in more legislation so that indeed it becomes immune if there's a government change. But we'll need to wait. So it's extremely uncertain at this stage.
A full repeal of the IRA. Clearly, I've got my own views on this, but what do you think about that in a Trump presidency?
I think it's unlikely because so today solar is probably the biggest employer in the U.S. And so it's unlikely that these things actually are fully repealed. You saw in the past that Trump already spent 4 years there, and we actually kept seeing renewable deployment happening, especially in the mid-center of the U.S. So it's unlikely to happen. I think there will be a lot of narrative around it, but then trickling it down to actually different actions. And so most likely we'll see this momentum keep going, but still subject to uncertainty.
I mean, we touched on it a little bit before, but maybe we could talk about, other obstacles that you're seeing, especially that's impeding further development of renewables. I might get you to start with that, Tim, please.
Yeah, I guess probably the main, there's probably two main impediments that I'd see to investing in new renewables quite quickly. And one is transmission. And I mean, that's pretty obvious that we've moved from a system that was basically a bunch of very large coal-fired power stations connected via transmission lines to load centres to a much more dispersed nature of, smaller, variable renewable assets, wind and solar in, more locations. So that transmission will take a bit of time to build out. And so obviously you can't build a generator and connect it to a transmission grid until the transmission grid's ready. So transmission's underway though. There's plenty of renewable energy zone processes. We're seeing the first one here in New South Wales through the Central West Arana Res. So that's certainly an obstacle which governments are overcoming at the moment. Probably the second one, which is, in the newspaper most days, is this broad concept of social licence. And it's very well understood that obviously communities need to be brought on the journey and benefit from that investment in renewables. And I know that there's a lot of discussion around how to mitigate some of the impacts of whether they be visual or whatever they may be with renewables. But I think the key thing that the industry can probably do better is to identify how to get more value add in those communities from low-cost renewable energy. I often kind of say this in forums like this, that the best presentation I have ever seen on the nature of a just transition is the General Manager of Parks Shire Council in Central West New South Wales, where he provided a very optimistic view of, with low-cost renewables, you could do all kinds of things to increase the economic value add in that region before you then export the power out of that region. So instead of just exporting power, what if you used some of that energy to create new industries, particularly agricultural value-add industries? So I think the industry has got a lot that it could contribute there. How do we as an industry, renewable industry, work with local communities and local governments in particular so that they can then benefit from that low-cost renewable energy?
And outside of Australia, what are you seeing in New Zealand or more globally?
Look, we can build 4 times the amount of energy that we need for the next 25 years in New Zealand. And so for me, just getting to net zero by 2050 is a hygiene factor. How you use renewable energy as a new economic growth platform for your economy, I think, is where you move from hygiene to actually proactivity and really using renewables. Our grid is 88% renewable now. We'll get to 95 quite comfortably. We probably won't get much far past 95, but at 95% we'll still be world class, and we have the capacity to build 4 times the amount of energy at 95% renewability that we need.
I mean, obviously last year, I don't think you could get through a corporate meeting without talking about supply chain and inflation. Maybe you could touch on what you're seeing in terms of the evolution of capital costs and also how that's feeding through to PPA prices today. And I might start with you, Pedro.
Sure. On the supply chain side, I think both wind and solar, I think they have different issues today to discuss. So COVID, to a certain extent, bulldozed all onshore turbine providers, and today the sector is somehow on the back of Vestas, which in itself is a problem. And we have Vestas plus the Chinese turbine manufacturers. So it's really absorbing that supply and then making it harder, if you want, for the open market actually to operate. On the solar side, we have geopolitics playing a game. 90% of the ability to actually process and produce solar panels and inverters is today anchored in China. We have U.S. blocking Chinese direct imports with the Non-Circumvention Act, with the Uyghur Forced Act. And so geopolitics on the solar side is actually playing a serious game. So we have today the uncertainties of Europe in itself. Should they track U.S. and build their own abilities and facilities in Europe or not? Do they have, or does Europe have the sufficient economic and critical mass to play that game vis-a-vis the U.S.? And then other countries are trying to follow suit, and the open discussions exist. So all of that plays into the cost of capital, plus, of course, interest rates. And if you add this to the grid filters also that team is discussing, so very few projects today are actually being able to navigate through permitting, licensing, grid connection, and getting a PPA. So the good projects eventually have good PPAs, and the PPAs are there because they are very far in between. Last year in Australia, 1.5 gigawatts. That's too little for the potential of this country. This is as much as in Portugal, and Australia has 6 times the GDP and 1,000 times the space. And so the point is to navigate these filters with the cost of capital associated to this and a supply chain dynamics which is not obvious both on the wind and solar side. It's really creating this climate tension in the overall scheme of things, which is not obvious. And so far we are being able to close our economics because we have fewer projects to get to the finish line. And so in those projects, then they are scarce assets if they have been well developed. But we should have much more projects actually reaching the finish line.
And are you seeing, given what's happened to European prices, are you seeing that being reflected now in PPA prices, or potentially your willingness to sign PPA prices?
So today we're in Europe, less so in the US, because prices in the US actually never shot up comparing to Europe and Asia. But today in Europe we have the worst of both worlds, which is high interest rates and lower prices. Gas prices in January and February really fell down. So if that economic momentum is sustained, plus all the grid filter barriers that we have for development, it's not obvious how projects can be developed in the short term in Europe. And so some PPAs, and you'll see big techs, big data centers still wanting that demand and wanting to buy those energy credits. But we don't achieve the energy transition just on the back of Amazon and Microsoft buying racks and energy. That's simply not enough. It needs to cascade down to medium enterprises as well. And it's not cascading down because then the prices are not competitive.
I mean, obviously there's been a lot of discussion, and I've heard this from a number of corporates, around the demand of data centers and how that's leading to the signing of more corporate PPAs. Is that something that any one of you guys is seeing as a demand growth center?
We're certainly seeing it. I guess the evolution probably in the Australian market is some degree of evolution of the nature and the financial design of a PPA. We're certainly seeing a lot more interest from customers for just standard retail with 100% green stapled to it. And the reason for that is that with all the investment in batteries, I think with all of the large-scale batteries operating under construction or that have hit FID, I think we're up at like 6 or 7 gigs of new battery supply coming into the market. There's an appetite from particularly those commercial, more so than industrial customers, to want a firm retail agreement that's backed by renewables. And the nature of the Australian market is probably driving that evolution in a way that the rest of the world will probably eventually see, which is, if you take South Australia as a really good example, prices are negative now for 20, 30% of the year. And they're often negative to the point where renewables are switching off. Now, that's an unsustainable situation where if you've written a PPA on the supply side, you've locked in a price, but if all you've done is effectively substituted out price risk for output risk, it's not really helping you in the sense of risk management. Batteries can certainly help with that, but certainly customers signing longer term standard retail, which is a very new evolution in this market. If you go back, say, 5 years ago, most C&I customers were signing 3-year agreements at most. They're now much more willing to sign 7 or 10 years, particularly after the crisis in 2022 where prices went crazy. So there's an evolution of the financing at the same time that the evolution is going on in that supply chain. How businesses manage both of those concurrently, I guess, is a challenge, but also an opportunity to create value for customers.
And probably maybe a little unfair, but obviously the structural drivers for renewables appear, still to be intact, and we can talk about, the rate at which we build out the renewables. But I feel that train has already left. Everyone is definitely wanting this green energy. So, what needs to happen, do you think, for that to get recognised in listed markets? Do you want to start?
Sure. So today listed markets, and we have our exclusive vehicle for wind and solar, EDPR Renewables, is publicly traded. So we see today a massive short-term perspective on things. And so interest rates are up, our share price comes down, because and investors want to see cash flow and net income. Nobody's actually seeing the 2050 discussion down the road. And so today for listed markets and for infrastructure, it's these interest rates coupled then with the challenges that are being seen and witnessed on the ground, they do not provide an optimist view for listed renewable entities. And so if those entities then are dependent on public markets capital, which fortunately we are not, it's then a major barrier then for more development down the road and for more investment. On the bright side, we see today that with these interest rates and the projects that are actually coming online, they are having 200, 300 basis points above in terms of project IRR than we were getting before COVID. So structurally, if you think about that, all of this goes in cycles, we are actually locking in pretty interesting projects. We just feel that we could be locking much more, and the world needs many more projects to come online. And so that's a bit of a frustration because all these ecosystems have been getting themselves ready to deliver that 1 terawatt of energy every year, and we're not. We're half of that potential, and just because of China. Otherwise, we would be at a third of that potential that we need to do.
Yeah. And Malcolm, Tim, any comments?
I think there are two things from my perspective. One is your standard DCF model doesn't do really long-term infrastructure really well, and these are assets that ultimately will be decades in their lifetime. The second thing for us is the ESG discount and how that's applied. I mean, ultimately, energy is an ecosystem, and different companies will play different roles in that ecosystem. But if you want to add solar and wind into your grid, somebody has to firm that. And if you put 100% of the ESG discount on the firmer, there's no incentive to firm. And without firming, you can't get corporate PPAs to get your solar and wind projects away. So I think that the very narrow focus that the market takes on ESG and ESG filters is actually a real hindrance to listed companies being able to work as an ecosystem to build greater renewables into the grid.
Perfect. I might just open this to the floor just to see if there's any questions from anyone.
Hi there. It came up a little earlier, but on social licence, and maybe, Tim, this is one that you might know most about, but the issue about, I mean, call them NIMBYs or people with reasonable concerns, but a couple of things I've noted, I think just in the last month, is Victoria saying that one class of assets, renewable energy assets, won't be able to appeal to VCAT against their consents, and also talk of effectively, for want of a better word, nationalising the consenting process and taking it out of the hands of developers and putting it in the hands of something called VicGrid. Victoria is quite an interventionist jurisdiction within Australia, but is, just a question, is that something that you think, Tim, might occur more broadly? Is it something that's beneficial, or is it that I can imagine there's also some risks in governments taking on all of that risk and taking it out of the hands of developers and investors? Just interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't offer a view on how governments respond to this issue, but I think the industry could be doing a better job. And I say the industry more broadly because it's not just renewables anymore, it's also transmission providers. And I don't say this in a totally disrespectful way, but by their very nature, regulated networks are monopolies. And monopolies, as a rule, don't generally do conversations very well because they're used to getting their way. They're monopolies. So I think when it comes to transmission in particular, I think there is certainly a role for the renewable industry, the transmission sector, to come together a little bit more, particularly around things like Central West Orana RES or the New England RES or, Energy Connect or VNI, to try and deal with some of these kind of issues holistically, because a community that's going to be impacted by infrastructure doesn't want to have to deal with the transmission person today and then the wind farm tomorrow and then the solar plant the next day. And I think that's where, if we're really honest as an industry, we could do a much better job. Now, obviously, there's going to be competition concerns through that, so you're going to have to work through that. But I think the industry does need to lift its game, and that's something where you're starting to see a lot, more of that and better outcomes. But I think that collaboration across the supply chain is something which is really necessary in an expedited way. And perhaps if we do that really, really well, then governments will kind of go, okay, you're managing that really well. We're hearing a lot less noise that people are upset. Get on with the transition and keep power prices down for customers.
Thanks. Question for maybe Tim and Malcolm. I think you both talked about firming, and particularly in the Australian context, 40,000 megawatts over the next 10 years, that's massive. So what sort of mix of firming do you think might be appropriate over the next 10 years?
Put really simply, 40% short duration batteries, 40% longer duration, think of that as like pumped hydro, and then 20% something that looks like a gas turbine that's running on zero emission fuel. And so that's from a paper that we had in the Energy Journal, shameless plug for my academic career. But if you're interested in that, I can certainly make that paper available. But that's kind of the mix from a least cost perspective. And that's even if you're running it on prohibitively expensive fuel in today's cost structure, because you're able to minimise your CapEx, and the OpEx is occurring so infrequently to deal with those Dunkel-Flaherty conditions that it minimises total system cost.
We have a different set of challenges in New Zealand to Australia. First of all, we're hydro dominated, which runs on 5-year firming cycles. The second is we're a small island nation, and so our solar, unlike Queensland, for example, which has a beautiful bell curve, we're going to have a whole lot of fuzziness around our bell curves because clouds roll in and over our solar farms regularly, and our wind is a 24-hour correlation across our entire wind portfolio. So we're going to need much more gas firming options and biofuel firming options because of that. I mean, we can lose our wind for 3 to 5 days. In fact, 3 weeks ago, we had 3 days where 2,000 megawatts of wind was delivering 5 megawatts an hour, and it just dropped out for 3 days. So for us, batteries will play a smaller role in that. Our challenge is the longer cycle firming, the sort of weeks and months, and we don't have a solution for that at the moment.
My question's to the whole panel, but in an Australian context, you're seeing C&I customers, Tim, you mentioned going out 7 years, but the RET scheme ends in 2030. The question is for consumers who are wanting to actually have an impact and say in their reports going forward that they have had an impact, they've increased renewable power, what would be the sort of ideal PPA you'd see forward, which actually says we've made an impact beyond 100% green power, we've covered the firming, we've covered the other externalities that are coming in?
So we have written contracts that go beyond 2030 that talk about real physical linkages. So in other words, if asset X is ever producing X megawatts, you've got X, a proportion of X megawatts that will go to you. The guarantee of origin kind of framework that kind of then that the RET transitions into is really, really important. So how that now evolves is critical to providing that kind of fungibility. I guess the other key part of that is where you get some degree of fungibility between LGCs or REGOs and ACCUs. And that's something which we've been working with a few counterparties on as well. But to your point, it would be wonderful if we could get some certainty beyond 2030 about what that looks like.
Perfect. Any more questions? Then I'll let Tim run to his 4 o'clock meeting as I promised. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.